Galatians chapter 6 tonight. This could be studied in a lot more depth than what I've been giving attention to, but I just wanted to touch on a few small verses toward the very end that are important and maybe move on to something different after that. But what a great letter it is. A letter from Paul, the Apostle Paul. You know, I don't know if we really get the full impact of what that was. We all have, probably everyone in this auditorium has more than one Bible in their home, probably several. And we take so much for granted what God has given to us and the letters that Paul has. And I remember talking to people right after Russia had broken free and you could take scriptures in. And people talked in Russia about how they've been craving for years for an opportunity to sit down and read the Bible and never had it their whole life, except for pieces here and there that were smuggled in. And here we have the Word of God so plainly written to us in a variety of different translations, but in all in English, and we can compare and how blessed we are. So as we get to the end of this letter, whatever translation you use, it basically comes down to there's some little tidbits. I call them sometimes stepping stones. That Paul's going to hit this point and then that point, and just move right on. A whole lot could be said about any one of those things. Sermons or even books really written about it, but we're going to look at it just in passing here and draw some good things here. You can call them principles tonight if you like. But number one, in Galatians chapter 6, starting at verse 6. Unusual thing if you skim through it and not ever noticed it, but Paul says, "Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches." And I looked at that and I said, is Paul saying what I think he's saying? What he's comparing this to, I guess, is something that he writes about in another verse in 1 Timothy 5 and also in 1 Corinthians 9. But he's establishing, basically, a principle here, from what I'm reading here in Galatians and comparing it to the others, that it is scriptural to take money and pay a teacher, preacher, or an elder, or someone working in the church. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who's teaching, you see. Now there's a battle about that, particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. But in there and also in 1 Timothy 5, there's an allusion back, or a reference really, back to an Old Testament passage where the Bible is referencing about ox and says that an ox that's treading out the corn shouldn't be muzzled. What they're talking about there is a reference that if you've got an ox out in the field and he decides while he's out working to stop it and scoop up something and be chewing it while he continues to plow, that's fitting. But Paul makes a reference to that when he writes these other two letters and says, do you think God is worried about just the oxen? And he's talking about the fact that it is scriptural, it is right, it's fitting for a church to support a preacher or a teacher or an elder or whatever, however they want to work out that relationship. If it were not in those verses, you might want to question, why are we paying somebody when other people could stand up and do that? And I'm not saying that so much to justify particularly because I get paid, or Cody, or Craig, or whatever, but more than anything else, for us to understand if it's not written in the Bible, then we've got to question why are we doing certain things. And this one is. And so we want to do Bible things by Bible ways. And we ought to stop and think about everything that we do in life from that perspective. In our services, in our relationships, and other things. And for that reason, I really want to highlight, plus it's in the text as we're reading through it here. Enough said on that. Let's look down at verses 7, 8, and 9 here. Because these are some spectacular things for us to think about here. Verses 7 and 8, first of all, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. I want you to notice, first of all, the concept here about whatever a man sows. Whatever can be applied, I think, at least in two different directions. Whatever as far as in what kind or what type. And whatever thing he's sowing toward. And here he's talking about what's being laid out here as if he sows to the flesh, then he's going to reap to the flesh. Now, there's an interesting passage, and we've talked about it on occasions here, from Romans in chapter 1. As Paul is relating to people of the Roman area, and basically of all those in the Roman Empire, he's talking about God giving up on them because of certain things that they didn't do. And they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, verse 25 says. They stopped trusting God and started trusting a lie better, which you think, why? But, well, that's the way human beings are sometimes. But verse 26, he also says, for this reason God gave them up to their vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature, and likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Is he talking about what we're talking about? Men with men, committing what is shameful, and listen to the last part, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. So not only is it a sin, and there's a consequence down the road, spiritually speaking, of eternal death, but there's a penalty that's being paid in the process. They're reaping what they sow. Why is our AIDS epidemic such an epidemic? Homosexuality. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that's why it is so full-blown. Why is our culture striving so much to try to get rid of that? Because they're trying to reduce the penalty that God has laid out there for. Are they being punished for their sin? Well, in a sense, yes. But it obviously is an epidemic because there's a connection in there. And by the way, it's not just with homosexuals, but when you start sharing partners back and forth in a mix like that, which God has not at all ever accepted and has condemned, then there's, just the consequences of what we're paying. And here the Scripture is saying this. Now, go back to what we've just read in Galatians. And we read here that whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. If he sows to the flesh, he will reap certain consequences. Now, AIDS is not the only epidemic of our immorality here. There's STDs and a variety of different things. Because nobody understands the idea of a husband and wife relationship with one another and nobody else. And the consequences then come out of that. So that is one of the things that God's talking about here. Now we can talk about some other things here. Listening to, I think it was one of those good snowy days that we were home. Dr. Phil was on channel whatever here at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was talking with a couple here who was having a big issue over winning the lottery. And everybody always says, well, wouldn't that be great to win the lottery? And I comment once in a while to my sister about that, and she always says, David, you don't play the lottery. You have to play the lottery in order to win the lottery. To which I come back and say, but you play the lottery, and if you won and got $10 million, you would give me $1 million. She goes, you're right, I would. So, I've got my little backup there, and it'll never probably ever come about. But you see, the thing is, playing the lottery has ruined a lot of families. This couple that was there in Dr. Phil's audience and whatever had won the lottery. And life was falling apart. And then toward the end of discussing this, he comes back and he really hits it home, and he starts listing person after person that's won the lottery and how life has fallen apart and relationships got all corrupted because they're all focused on wealth. If you sow to the flesh, you're going to reap to the flesh. If that's all your focus is, and it doesn't have to be lottery, it could be you have $5 and you're arguing over that, but that's the product of where our culture will take you. Our ladders of success, you can also say, have created a lot of dilemmas in family relationships, particularly those that are not balanced with a proper spiritual perspective, as God tells us. No man can serve two masters, Jesus says. You'll either love the one and hate the one other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't love God and riches, Jesus says. Job puts it together like this in chapter 4, verse 8. He says, those who plow iniquity and trouble reap the same. In whatever facet. Going back to the Galatian point here. He who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. Spiritually speaking, if nothing ever happens, and sometimes you'll look at some people that they just got it all together, except they don't ever go to church, they could care less about God, they might be an atheist, but everything in their life seems so great and so grand and whatever. But as we sing in the song, there's a great day coming. And when the Lord returns, or when that person passes on, there's a great awakening. They will, of the flesh, reap corruption. There's a warning side, but there's also a promise side to that. As you'll notice here, it says, he that sows to the flesh will reap to the flesh, but he who sows to the Spirit will, of the Spirit, reap everlasting life. And I think that's kind of interesting here, particularly when I think about what Amos says about those that sow to the wind, reap a whirlwind. Now that's a plank. In other words, you're going to get it back 10 times worse, but the promise has the same thing. If you sow to the Spirit, you're going to reap not just a little bit of spiritual whatever, but eternal life. I think that's great, the way God puts that whole thing in perspective here. And he's letting us understand, choice is yours. So as we're looking at what's going on here, that's that principle about sowing and reaping. Now, along with that, and the idea of the amounts that are involved in that, whatever you sow in whatever amount, you're going to reap tenfold or 100-fold. Again, the Amos passage, sow to the wind, and it's a whirlwind when you get through. One venturous whatever over here can produce a lifetime of disaster in another direction. So in amount and in kind and type here. Now, let's look at principle number 2, back in the very same verse, the very first part of that. Be not deceived. Principle number 2, as we're looking at what's going on in life, is Satan's good. He is really good. As we look into Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, he's been good from the very beginning about deceiving people. He can take such an innocent thing of looking at a tree and turn it into the most can't avoid. You got to have it right now kind of thing where you've got everything else out there. Why do you need this? And yet it becomes that way. He can take a great man who's called the man after God's own heart, David, this guy that wrote all, or at least a lot of the Psalms that are in the Psalms, and he could take this David character and he can plant a seed in his mind, even when he already has as many wives and concubines as he wants, and cause him to commit adultery. Be not deceived. Fact is, Satan's good. Principle number 2, you wake up in the morning, file it. Satan's after you, and he's after you, and he's going to deceive you. He's not going to say, well, today, David, I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tempt you this way and that way. Now, if you're reading your Bible and praying, then you're likely probably not going to listen to me, but he doesn't do it that way. Not at all, as you well know. And yet, why are we so deceived? I don't know. Really and truly. Other than all those things look so tempting and delightful, we think we've just got to have it. And they're captivated. So amazing about all that. Well, principle number 4, and I really like what's wrapped up in this. In verse 9, this is parallel to one of my favorite verses in the Bible here. But in Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, he says, and let us not grow weary while doing good. I know some Christians that are literally wearing themselves out in God's service. And they're thinking constantly about what else can I do? What else can I do to improve here? And how else can I add this into my life? And what can I do for that person, this person? And I'm looking at a lot of them tonight. And it's such a neat thing here as he's talking about this, because he's reminding us in this audience that don't grow weary. But in due season you will reap if you don't give up, basically, if you do not lose heart. You see, in our service to God, as you know, you keep doing so much and you think, as you're looking at it, it really isn't making much headway. I'm hardly making a dent in that person's life. The other day, he might have listened to me just for the first time, or she might have thought, maybe I'll go to church sometime, or I might have got a smile out of that person, or rather than just cursing all the time, they might have looked at me and skipped the curse word at that moment. I just don't know if I'm making any difference, and is it really worth it? And you're evaluating your results the way you see them and wondering if it's worth it. And what Paul is saying, by God's inspiration, who sees the hearts of the individuals, who looks over the long range of lifetime and centuries of time, and he says, in due season you will reap, this is the good side now, if you don't give up. So beautiful in that. Now, here's the thing. Again, remember, besides serving God, Satan's out there trying to do what he can to keep anything from happening good, to keep the church from growing, to keep you from being effective. And if he sees that these little things that you're doing are making a difference, if you don't see them, that's good for him. He's going to try to conceal that from you. He'll do all that he can to make it look terrible, to make it look like it's just a waste of time, to discourage you, because it is good. So to defeat you, he's going to try to stop that good, you see. And that's why I think this verse is here. He'd love to have blinders on our eyes and for us to feel like we're just blind out here in the world. We're not really making a difference, and you might as well give up, because we are making a difference. We are a lighthouse to the downtown community. We are making an impact with our friends in school, or our friends at work, or wherever we go. We make a difference by just being different than anybody else. And it's seen. People may not comment to you, but it's seen. And it's seen as being different than the rest of the world. And when you see it in somebody else's life, you automatically see and you go, wow, what a refreshing person that is, just when you're with them. That's the same way they look at us, and ought to be that way. They ought to be seeking it out just like people sought out Jesus. And so we know for a fact, because God says it's that way. Now Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:58, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in work of the Lord, knowing that your work in the Lord, labor in the Lord, is not in vain. It makes a difference. So you come in, you're drug out, you've been at CYC, you've been working all week, and you're doing all these things, and you just look at your life and think, man, I'm exhausted out my high. Just know you're making a difference. And people that are sending cards and doing whatever, sometimes you look and think, well, am I really making a difference? I don't ever hear anything, feedback. You're making a difference. I've got a stack of them at home now from people who wrote me over the past few weeks, to my wife, because of her father's passing. And what a difference it makes to look at those notes and know somebody's thinking of me. Somebody's praying for me. And so whatever we do and whatever we say, we understand here this principle that with God working through us will make a difference. But Satan alongside you at the same time will try to keep you from thinking you're making a difference, to discourage you. So don't give up. How great. So then in verse 10 he says this, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all. And then he adds to this, especially to those who are the household of faith. That's a unique way of describing, in other words, your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. So do good to everybody. And if there's something especially out there that a brother needs, he's probably down and out, or she's not having a good time, then give them a special something. Because they're out there serving, and sometimes it's not easy. Out there in the ruts and working through things. God does a lot of things to strengthen us and help us. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. friend of mine who was an elder for a number of years, and because of health principles there in Oak Ridge, he had to give it up. But his favorite verse, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or imagine, to him be the glory in the church. The church makes a difference. And with God at our side, we can do exceedingly abundantly above all those things. Don't sell yourself short of what God can do through you. You make an impact. Stay at it. Avoid Satan. He'll do you in. Don't be deceived. How's your life tonight? I know tired. I understand that. But if there's somebody that's not right with God, somebody that's leaning the wrong way, or maybe just wrapped up in the flesh, whatever thing it is, change it. And if it needs to be publicly changed because other people know, then get that right tonight. Maybe you just need prayers. We're always here, always ready, always available. Not as good as Jesus, but we represent him on this side.